Hello, American literature students. I wanted to make a short video to talk to you about some themes that you are going to see or that you have seen in the stories, particularly by Freeman and by Jewett, but you'll also be seeing it in some texts that are coming up in the next week or two. Um, so before I launch into the specifics, I'm talking about domestic fiction, sometimes called sentimental fiction, sometimes called women's fiction, that was really popular in the decades leading up to when our class starts, in the mid 1800s before the Civil War. These works of literature, these novels, were huge sellers. They were written primarily by middle class white women and read primarily by middle class white women. And they were meant to reflect the way that these women should see the world and think about the world. So to understand that, let's look at that some historical context. Historians now refer to the way of thinking about women's roles as the cult of true womanhood. This is also known as the cult of domesticity. Again, these are not words that were used in the 1800s. These are terms that historians more recently have used to describe these basic expectations of how women should behave, and then by contrast, how men might be expected to behave. There are four major characteristics or four major qualities that middle class white women were expected to possess, and the first one is domesticity. This comes from the ideology of the separate spheres, that there's the public sphere, the sphere of work, business, and politics, to which men most naturally belonged, and then the private sphere, the home. And this is the realm that women were seen to be most natural at. We still see this to some degree. So the home was women's realm, and women were seen as much more naturally inclined toward parenting, raising children. Think about that when you think about the Luck of Roaring Camp. Remember, men weren't supposed to really be involved except for maybe a little bit on the side in parenting. Okay, the second characteristic or quality that women were supposed to possess is piety. It was thought that women were just naturally more religious. All people were expected to be religious, but piety came more naturally, they thought, to women. This really helped with the private sphere thing. Women, because they were at home all the time, or most of the time, were protected from some of the sinful ways of the public world. And so women were supposed to have sort of a pious influence on their husbands when they came home from the evils of the public world. The third quality is submissiveness. Women were at all times supposed to submit first to their fathers and then to their husbands. They were not ever supposed to argue or have a difference of opinion. In fact, one of the reasons it took so long for women to get the right to vote is because people assumed that no matter whether women voted or not, they would just reflect what their husbands told them to do. Mathematically, it would just mean twice as many votes for each candidate. It didn't really make any sense. The idea that a woman would have an opinion apart from her husband didn't really register, or certainly didn't strike people as normal at this time. And finally, the last characteristic that women were supposed to possess is sexual purity until marriage. Again, there's a double standard here. Women were supposed to be more pure than men, and certainly they were not supposed to express or feel any kind of desire. That's just bad. So from there, I want to step back a little bit and look at what we call the hero's journey. This is something you may have studied in a mythology course. For example, Joseph Campbell, the scholar, noted what he called the monomyth, the basic plot points in a lot of Western stories, a lot of stories around the world, really, that we have come to rely on and value. And I'm really oversimplifying here for the sake of time. These stories in the hero's journey featured a boy who's typically orphaned and typically born into or by unusual circumstances. That boy gets some sort of call to adventure, and he is faced with some sort of quest that he must accomplish. en route to accomplishing this quest, he faces many battles. These battles are often quite literally physical battles, but they're also tests of character. If the hero or the hero to be is strong enough and brave enough, courageous, he will pass these battles and he will pass these tests. He will succeed and go on to complete his journey. So his quest is achieved, and there's typically a homecoming of some sort, often with a wife who has kept the hearth fires warm for him. You might recognize this basic plot pattern in things like Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Lion King, all kinds of our stories and myths, the Odyssey, rely on this basic plot pattern. Of course, there are variations and differences. Okay, so this brings us to women. You'll notice that the protagonists of those heroes' journeys that I was talking about are always men. Why didn't they feature women? Well, because women weren't supposed to go anywhere. Remember the domestic sphere that women were relegated to. This is one of the reasons that domestic fiction, or women's fiction of the time, wasn't always canonical. It wasn't always thought important or good enough to be in the canon, because it was just silly domestic stuff, right? Women were always supposed to stay at home. But again, as I mentioned earlier, these novels were selling like crazy. They outsold the canonical works like, for example, The Scarlet Letter by quite a good margin. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, in fact, referred to the authors of these texts as a damned mob of scribbling women. So let's take a look at what these novels were and why they were so popular. They tended to feature a young orphan girl. Sometimes this young orphan girl was very deprived. Other times she was an heiress, but she typically had to make her way in the world on her own. The overplot. This is what we call this, the basic plot points of the marriage plot. The setting was always domestic, either in somebody's home or in some sort of boarding school. Maybe the young girl was old enough to be a governess or a servant of some kind in somebody's house, but the setting is typically domestic because, again, that's the realm that girls are expected to stay in. The quest in this case is to marry well. Remember that at this time when women are relegated to the private sphere, the only real way many of them can be financially secure is through marriage. So marrying well becomes not just a matter of romantic interest, but it becomes a matter of livelihood, of survival. So in the orphan girls version of this quest, her battles, her tests, they might not be physical battles like fighting off big monsters in the middle of an ocean or fighting off Voldemort. The tests are seduction attempts. This is why the marriage plot is often called the plot of seduction. Some handsome, wealthy man wants to seduce her, and he makes it very, very tempting. If she resists these tests, if she passes these tests and does not allow herself to be seduced, well, excuse me, let's talk first about whether she fails. If she fails, she then faces illness, ostracism, isolation, maybe pregnancy, although that couldn't be written about very openly, and then eventually death. In other words, she is definitely punished if she is seduced. Remember, the cult of true womanhood said that women are supposed to remain sexually pure, and if she violates that expectation, she's pretty much done for. So these novels sent the message that if you violate these norms of behavior, you'll be punished. Your life will be ruined. If she passes, though, you can imagine that she's rewarded with marriage. A good man comes along who's also handsome and rich, but he's virtuous. And so these novels typically end with a marriage to a good man, and we can tell that they're going to live happily ever after. Again, that's why they're called the marriage plot. Again, these novels are mainly popular before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, when our class begins, and when realism starts to take hold, we start to see women writers, female writers, who are continuing to work within that marriage plot because it's so familiar to their readers. But they start to maybe offer a twist on that marriage plot. They start to imagine perhaps endings for their female characters that are different. Maybe these stories don't end in marriage. So I want you to think about um, how this applies to a New England nun, how it might apply to a white heron, how it's going to apply in next week's reading to Daisy Miller and the Yellow Wallpaper. There are multiple ways to interpret the literature I've assigned, of course, and one way is through the lens of the marriage plot and the cult of domesticity, and how these characters are working within those expectations, but also defying them at the same time. If you have any questions about any of this, bring them up on the discussion board, and I'll see you there.